I first saw the widow on the fourth rotation of Astera Prime, during a diplomatic vigil meant to last only an hour and already stretching into its third. The chamber was carved from living crystal, translucent walls breathing softly, with bioluminescent veins. Hundreds of delegates from a dozen species stood in concentric circles, heads bowed, mandibles folded, crests dimmed in ritual silence. And then there was her. She stood apart from the others, not by position but by gravity. Tall, even among her kind, with slate-blue skin etched by faint silver lines that pulsed slowly like a second heartbeat. Her eyes, 4 of them, arranged in a gentle arc, were closed, but I felt them anyway. The weight of her presence pressed against my chest like thin air at altitude. She wore morning black, a living fabric that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. No insignia, no jewels, only a simple circlet of dark metal around her brow. A widow. I shouldn't have been staring. Humans were guests here, fragile newcomers in an old and wary galactic council. Staring at royalty, especially grieving royalty, was a good way to end negotiations before they began. But something about her drew my eyes back, again and again. Ambassador Hale, my aide whispered through the neural link. You're drifting. I blinked and forced my gaze forward. Sorry, I murmured. Long day. That was true enough. The death of the Zarathi High Sovereign had shaken half the spiral arm, and Earth had been invited to observe the rites. A courtesy, a test. And she, I later learned, was Queen Sailira Vethran, widow of the fallen sovereign, ruler of the Zarathi ascendancy in a time when weakness invited extinction. The vigil ended with a low harmonic note that vibrated through bone and crystal alike. Delegates dispersed in careful patterns. I prepared to leave quietly, unnoticed. I failed. Human. The word reached me not through sound, but directly into my mind. Cool, precise, unmistakably addressed to me. I turned. Queen Sailira stood only a few paces away. Up close, she was even more striking. The silver lines along her skin traced elegant patterns, converging at her temples and down her neck. Her eyes were open now, studying me with unsettling clarity. You were watching, she said. My mouth went dry. Your Majesty, I apologize if... It is not forbidden, she interrupted. Merely uncommon. I inclined my head, choosing honesty over diplomacy. I was curious. A pause. Long enough that I wondered if I'd just doomed humanity's first alliance. Then, unexpectedly, the faintest flicker of color rippled along her markings. Curiosity, she said, is a human trait, yes? Among others, I replied. She tilted her head, studying me as one might a puzzle that refused to fit its frame. Walk with me. It wasn't a request. The gardens of Astera Prime were grown, not built. Vast terraces of alien flora drifting on magnetic fields, petals opening and closing in slow, tidal rhythms. We walked in silence for several minutes, escorted at a discreet distance by her guards. My husband is dead, she said abruptly. I stiffened. I'm sorry for your loss. You are not, she replied calmly. You did not know him. That doesn't mean... It does to us. She stopped near a pool of luminous water. Grief among my people is not shared lightly. Yet you watched me as if you felt it. I hesitated, then answered truthfully. I wasn't watching your grief. I was watching your strength. That earned me another long look. Explain. You stood alone in a room full of power, I said. And none of it leaned on you. That's rare. Silence stretched. The water pulsed brighter. You are perceptive, she said at last. This is also uncommon. I smiled faintly. It gets me into trouble. So I have sensed. She turned to face me fully. Up close, the air hummed faintly around her, charged with restrained energy. You are not like the others, she said. Most see a throne. Or a threat. And you? I asked before I could stop myself. She studied me for a long moment. I see a variable. That should have unsettled me. Instead, something in my chest tightened. Not fear, but recognition. Tell me, human, she continued, what do your kind do with widows? The question caught me off guard. There's no single answer. Some retreat. Some rebuild. Some change everything. Which path do you think I walk? I met her gaze. The last one. Her markings flared briefly, bright silver. Surprise, maybe. Or approval. You will dine with me, she said. Again, not a request. The dinner was nothing like I expected. No grand hall. No audience. Just a private chamber overlooking the planet's sunlit horizon, a table grown from crystal and living wood. The guards remained outside. I rarely do this, she said as we sat her day, but the council watches me closely. They expect a widow to be brittle. You don't strike me as brittle. No, she agreed. I am something else now. The food was alien but surprisingly compatible with human biology, prepared by a neutral culinary AI. We spoke of small things at first. Earth's oceans, Zarathi starcraft, the peculiar human fondness for obsolete music. Then, gradually, the conversation deepened. My husband ruled through force, she said. It kept us alive, but it also made us feared. And fear is unstable, I said. Exactly. She leaned back slightly. When he died, half the ascendancy expected me to continue as before. The other half waits for me to fail. And what do you want? Her eyes locked onto mine. I want to survive without becoming what killed him. I exhaled slowly. That's a hard line to walk. You walk such lines constantly, she said. Your species is weak, fragmented, and yet you endure. Stubbornness, I said, and a talent for unlikely alliances. Something shifted in her expression then. Not sorrow. Not curiosity. Calculation. Would you advise me? She asked softly. I frowned. As an ambassador, I can offer perspectives. Not. As a human, she said. Widowed by history. Scarred by loss. Yet still reaching outward. The room seemed suddenly smaller. I can try, I said carefully. Her gaze softened, just a fraction. Then stay. The unexpected thing wasn't that I stayed. It was how quickly staying became dangerous. Whispers followed me through the palace. Zarathi nobles watched with narrowed eyes, sensing influence where none had been declared. My own superiors sent increasingly tense messages, warning me not to become entangled. But I saw her daily, in councils, in private strategy sessions, in quiet moments overlooking the stars. And slowly, subtly, the ascendancy began to change. Trade routes reopened. Border skirmishes halted. Former enemies received cautious overtures instead of preemptive strikes, all under the guise of temporary adjustments during mourning. She's reshaping an empire, my aide whispered one night. And she's doing it with you standing beside her. I'm not pulling strings, I said. No, the aide replied. You're showing her they exist. The breaking point came during the Conclave of Blades, a ritual gathering where rival houses tested the ruler's right to command. Blood was expected. Queen Sailira stood before them, unarmed. I will not prove my worth through death, she declared. We have had enough of it. The chamber erupted in fury. Accusations of weakness, betrayal, calls for her abdication. I felt the danger before I saw it, the subtle shift of energy as one noble reached for a concealed weapon. I moved without thinking. The shot never fired. I stood between Sailira and the attacker, my body shielding hers. The impact slammed me backward, pain blooming white-hot across my side. Chaos followed.
Guards.
Restraints.
Shouting.
Through it all, I felt her presence, sharp, focused, furious. They took me to the medical wing. The wound was bad, but not fatal. She arrived minutes later, dismissing everyone else. "You risked your life," she said quietly. "Yes," I admitted. "Why?" I met her gaze, pain dulling my filters. "Because someone had to show them you weren't alone." Her markings flared brighter than I'd ever seen, silver turning almost white. "You are not bound to me," she said. "You owe me nothing." "I know." Silence stretched. Then she reached out, hesitant, deliberate, and placed her hand over mine. "In my people's history," she said softly, "unexpected bonds have changed the course of civilizations." I smiled weakly. Humans are good at that. I recovered slowly. During that time, the ascendancy changed forever. Sailira emerged not as a warrior queen, but as a reformer, tempered, resolute, unyielding in a new way. The houses bent or broke. The council adapted. And Earth gained an ally no one had predicted. On my last day on Astera Prime, I stood once more in the gardens with her. "You will return to your world," she said. "Yes." "But this is not an ending," she said. "It is a divergence." I nodded. "I think so too." She studied me for a long moment, then inclined her head in a gesture that, among her people, was reserved for equals. "When I first felt your eyes on me," she said, "I thought them an intrusion. And now, she said, "I think they were a mirror." I left the palace knowing history would debate what happened next. Some would call it diplomacy. Others would whisper of something deeper. But I knew the truth. The alien widow caught my eyes on her, and in doing so, caught a glimpse of a different future. And, against all odds, she chose it. I left Astera Prime believing the hardest part was behind us. I was wrong. The message reached Earth 3 months later, encoded in Zerathi royal cipher and routed through channels reserved for existential threats. By the time it reached my terminal, I was already being escorted to the United Earth Assembly Chamber. Queen Sailira was under siege, not by foreign enemies, but by her own bloodlines. The reforms she'd enacted had fractured the ascendancy. Old houses that thrived on conquest had united under a single banner, invoking an ancient clause, the widow's trial, a ritualized civil conflict meant to test the legitimacy of softened rulers. Translated plainly, either she proved she could still inspire absolute loyalty, or she would be removed.
Permanently.
The assembly erupted into argument. Earth was young,
Weak.
barely tolerated among the elder powers. Intervention would be seen as arrogance, or worse, provocation. I stood slowly, ignoring the protests. "She didn't ask for an army," I said. "She asked for a witness." Silence followed. I knew what that meant. Astera Prime was different when I returned. The skies burned with defensive auroras. War fleets hovered at the edge of orbit like carrion birds. The palace gardens were shuttered, their living petals closed tight in fear. Sailira met me in the same chamber where I had once stood bleeding for her. "You came," she said. "I said I would," I replied. Her markings were dimmer now, her strength coiled inward like a star on the verge of collapse. Yet when she stood before her people during the trial, her voice carried across the crystal amphitheater without amplification. "They say I have grown weak," she declared. "They say I rule with hesitation." She turned, Not to her generals, not to her rivals, but to me. This is the human who stood unarmed between me and death. This is the species they call fragile. Tell me, does weakness bleed for another without command? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Then came the unexpected moment, the thing no strategist had predicted. Sailira removed her circlet. Gasps erupted. Among the Zarathi, that act meant absolute vulnerability. If strength is measured only in destruction, she continued, then strike me down. But if strength is measured in what we choose to protect, then look upon the future I have chosen. She knelt before me. The gesture shattered centuries of doctrine. I didn't let her stay there. I stepped forward and knelt as well. Not as an ambassador. Not as a subordinate. As an equal. The amphitheater went utterly silent. I do not rule her, I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected. Nor does she rule me. But I have seen what her reign prevents. Worlds burned, children orphaned, widows multiplied. If that is weakness, then perhaps the galaxy has misunderstood strength. No weapons were drawn. No blood spilled. One by one, the rival houses withdrew their banners. The trial ended, not in victory or defeat, but in surrender. In the cycles that followed, historians would struggle to name what happened next. Alliance was too shallow a word. Union too provocative. But something irrevocable had formed. Earth and the Zarathi ascendancy bound themselves not through conquest or marriage treaties, but through mutual guardianship, a pact stating that an attack on one would be answered by both. Queen Sailira invited me to remain. I declined.
For a time.
Because futures, like stars, require distance to see clearly. I returned a year later. This time, not as an ambassador. The gardens bloomed again, brighter than before. Zarathi children, rare, luminous beings, played beneath the floating terraces. The ascendancy had stabilized. Trade flourished. Borders softened. And Sailira, she was no longer the widow the galaxy remembered. We stood together at the edge of the crystal balcony, watching the system's twin suns descend. My people no longer fear the dark, she said quietly, because they have learned they do not face it alone. I smiled. Humans are good at that. Standing together in places we shouldn't survive. She turned to me then, all four eyes reflecting starlight. There is something you should know, she said. Her markings pulsed, warm, steady. In our biology, true bonds leave traces. When two beings alter each other's path irrevocably, a legacy forms. I felt my breath catch. You're saying, I am no longer alone, she said gently. And neither are you. The galaxy would never call it romance, never call it destiny. But centuries from now, when historians spoke of the age where wars slowed and empires learned restraint, they would trace it back to one moment. The moment an alien widow caught a human watching her grief. And something unexpected happened. Not love, not conquest, but the birth of a future neither species could have reached alone.